Before we start, one honest correction to the headline you just heard, because getting this right matters more than getting it dramatic. There was no single strike this week that trapped 250,000 Russian soldiers overnight. What is real, and what is arguably more interesting than a single explosion, is a months-long campaign that has slowly turned Crimea from a fortified Russian stronghold into a peninsula running on fumes, rationed electricity, and a road nicknamed by Ukrainian soldiers as the Highway of Death. That's the story we're going to walk through, and every claim in it is going to be tied to a name you can check for yourself. Start with the night of August 7th, 2026. According to Ukraine's General Staff, reported through Ukrinform, units of Ukraine's defense forces struck an early warning radar station near the town of Olenivka in western Crimea. In the same operation, they hit two ground-based relay stations, one at Olenivka and another across the water at Zalizny Port in Kherson Oblast. Those relays aren't glamorous targets. They don't look like much in a satellite photo. But according to the General Staff's own statement, those relay stations are what pass commands between drone operators and Russia's Gerin and Gerbera attack drones, extending their range and keeping them under control. Knock out the relay, and the drone doesn't just go quiet, it goes blind. The same night's operation also hit a site used for storing, preparing, and launching strike drones in the area of Vardiske, again according to the General Staff's own statement from August 7th. That strike didn't happen in isolation. It was the latest entry in a pattern that stretches back through the first week of August alone. On the night of August 5th, per the General Staff, as reported by the outlet UNN, Ukrainian forces struck drone control centers and other facilities, while also destroying a crossing over the Mokry Yali River in Donetsk region, and a warehouse inside Crimea itself. 2 nights before that, on August 3rd, the General Staff confirmed a strike on the repair and restoration base belonging to a Russian artillery brigade stationed in Crimea, along with a site used to prepare strike drones, logistics warehouses, and a communications hub. UNN specifically named the location struck that night: warehouses near Okunivka and Naumivka in Crimea, and a communications hub near Artemivka, also inside Crimea. Local monitoring channels reported explosions and fires in the city of Kerch that same night, though that specific detail comes from unofficial monitoring accounts rather than a government statement, so we'll treat it as reported rather than confirmed. To understand why Ukraine keeps hitting the same peninsula night after night, you have to go back further than this week. Crimea was annexed by Russia in 2014, and since then, Moscow has spent billions of dollars turning it into one of the most heavily militarized pieces of real estate in Europe. Frigates, diesel submarines, S-400 air defense batteries, tens of thousands of servicemen, along with new airfields, garrisons, and command centers. For most of the full-scale war that began in 2022, Crimea functioned as a rear base, a place Russian forces could stockpile, repair, and resupply relatively free from serious threat. That changed as Ukraine's drone and missile capabilities matured, and it changed decisively with what's now referred to, per a June 2026 Kiev Post report, as the Middle Strike Campaign. According to that Kiev Post reporting, cited in an English Wikipedia summary of the campaign, the effort was launched by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces in early April 2026, with a specific goal: engineer a logistics breakdown for Russian forces occupying Crimea and the adjacent mainland regions of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. The term middle strike refers to targets at what's called operational depth, roughly 25 to 200 kilometers behind the front line, far enough back that Russian commanders once assumed they were safe, close enough that hitting them still cripples the front. Here's where that 250,000 figure actually comes from. And it's worth being precise about it, because precision is the difference between real reporting and manufactured outrage. The same Kiev Post report estimated that somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 Russian ground troops occupying Ukraine's Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea regions are dependent on the supply lines that this campaign is targeting. That is a huge number, and it's a legitimate one to talk about. But dependent on strained supply lines is not the same claim as stranded by a single strike. And if we're going to talk about Crimea honestly, we have to hold that distinction. Those troops mostly fall under the command of Russia's 5th and 8th Combined Arms Armies, according to the same reporting, and the Ukrainian side running this campaign against them is comparatively tiny. An estimated 5,000 to 8,000 drone operators and maintainers, organized into units of just 300 to 500 personnel, each capable of launching 30 to 40 one-way attack drones per strike package, according to the Kiev Post's figures. So, what does it actually look like when 250,000 plus troops start depending on supply lines that are under constant pressure? It looks like what's been happening in Crimea for the last several months, and it isn't subtle. Start with the Kerch Bridge, the 19-kilometer span that has connected Crimea to mainland Russia since it opened in 2018, carrying both vehicle and rail traffic across the Kerch Strait. It has already been struck 3 separate times going back to 2022, most recently in an underwater mining operation that Ukraine's SBU security service confirmed, and that the specialist outlet The War Zone covered in detail, noting Ukrainian officials called the bridge, in their words, an absolutely legitimate target given its use in supplying Russian troops. As a direct result of the cumulative damage, the bridge has been restricted for heavy and hazardous cargo, meaning Russia can no longer reliably move military trucks, fuel tankers, and armored equipment across it the way it once did. And when the bridge itself isn't the target, the infrastructure around it is. On June 21st, 2026, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed on Telegram that strikes had hit both sides of the Crimean bridge in a single night, targeting maritime oil logistics in Russia's Krasnodar region on one side and an oil depot in the city of Kerch on the other. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander, Robert Brovdy, known by the call sign Madyar, said on Telegram that the same operation hit oil terminals, gas compressors, and radar systems. With the bridge increasingly unreliable for military logistics, Russia has leaned harder on an alternative, a land corridor running through occupied southern Ukraine, referred to in Ukrainian military channels as the Novorossiya Highway, sometimes darkly nicknamed the Highway of Death by the soldiers targeting it. According to Commander Brovdy, cited in the Wikipedia summary of the campaign, Russian military cargo traffic along that highway fell by 71% over a 2-week period in June 2026 alone, as a direct result of the Middle Strike campaign. That's not a rounding error. That's a supply route nearly cut in half twice over for an occupying force that depends on it to move fuel, ammunition, and equipment to the front. The knock-on effects inside Crimea have been documented by multiple outlets independently, which is exactly the kind of pattern that makes a story credible rather than convenient. In July 2026, a prolonged blackout hit the peninsula, leaving 4 million subscribers without power simultaneously, according to reporting compiled by UNN. Gasoline prices in Crimea reportedly reached 269 rubles per liter, alongside rising food prices, per the same reporting. Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the GUR, said publicly that the crisis on the peninsula was deepening, specifically due to problems with electricity, water, and fuel, a statement UNN reported on August 4th. Commander Brovdy separately confirmed the destruction of 10 energy hubs in occupied territory on the night of August 3rd alone, and said the cumulative tally of the operation from July 1st through August 3rd stood at 187 energy targets struck. That is a scale of sustained infrastructure targeting that goes well beyond a single dramatic headline. Al Jazeera's on-the-ground reporting from June 2026 captured what this actually feels like for people living there, military and civilian alike. The outlet described Crimea as, in the words of one former Russian militant now imprisoned for criticizing Moscow's military conduct, no longer a resort, but a frontline region. Ukrainian drones, according to that same Al Jazeera report, have struck fuel depots, air defense systems, airfields, military bases, and command centers across the peninsula, along with vessels belonging to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which has already relocated a significant portion of its remaining ships to the Russian port of Novorossiysk after losing roughly a third of its fleet earlier in the war. Local tourism, once a point of pride for occupied Crimea, has also collapsed under the pressure. The same reporting and the Wikipedia summary of the campaign both note that Crimean beaches emptied out as Russian tourists left or tried to leave, with some visitors reportedly requesting help evacuating the peninsula because they could no longer leave under their own power. Fuel logistics tell perhaps the starkest version of this story. Petro Andriushchenko of Ukraine's Center for the Study of Occupation stated publicly, in reporting reflected in the Wikipedia summary of the campaign, that Russian authorities were offering civilian fuel truck drivers 100,000 rubles for a single return trip into Crimea in early June 2026. Just a week and a half later, that offer had jumped to 300,000 rubles per trip, roughly 3,000 euros, because so many drivers were refusing the run out of fear for their own safety along the exposed highway corridor. Some drivers, according to the same reporting, resorted to disguising fuel shipments as other kinds of cargo just to make the crossing. When an occupying military has to nearly triple hazard pay to convince civilian truckers to drive fuel into a war zone, that's not propaganda framing. That's a supply chain under visible strain. And it's the kind of detail that doesn't require exaggeration to be alarming on its own. Bridges beyond the Kerch crossing have taken similar punishment. On June 18, 2026, a railway bridge crossing the North Crimean Canal near the village of Rozdolne was struck in a drone attack, according to the monitoring channel Crimean Wind, with Ukraine's general staff confirming the attack the following day, per Kyiv Independence reporting. That bridge sat on the Kerch-Jankoy railway line, a key route for moving military equipment and fuel toward Russian forces on the southern front. Days later, on June 23rd, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said they destroyed a separate railway bridge over the same canal, also near Rozdolne, according to reporting from the Kyiv Post. That same report described Kerch Commercial Port's oil depot being struck and set on fire, confirmed by the monitoring outlet Astra, along with damage to the TES terminal oil storage and transshipment complex in Kerch, a facility the Kyiv Post described as a major logistics hub for oil products and liquefied gas in the region. Traffic on the Kerch Bridge itself was reportedly blocked around 7 in the morning that day, and a fire was reported on the Arabat Spit, an area where Russian troops are stationed, according to the same Kyiv Post reporting. Further north, the pressure has extended into occupied Kherson region as well. The Moscow Times reported that Ukrainian strikes in late July and early August 2026 damaged several bridges linking occupied Kherson with Crimea, forcing the closure of the Chonhar Bridge and pushing traffic onto alternative crossings that were themselves damaged within days. Russian-installed Kherson official Vladimir Saldo confirmed the damage in a telegram post, saying specialists were inspecting the structures, according to the Moscow Times. The Chonhar Bridge sits on the R218 highway, a route that connects the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don all the way to Simferopol, Crimea's capital. When that corridor is disrupted, the ripple effects reach the entire peninsula, not just the coastline near the bridge itself. It's worth being honest here about what remains contested, because a credible account of this war has to include the other side's framing too, not just Kyiv's. Russian state-aligned commentary, including pieces circulated through pro-Kremlin outlets, has pushed back hard on the idea that this campaign represents any kind of crisis for Russian forces. One such commentary argued that every time the Ukrainian army loses ground on the front lines, in its words, it plays the Crimean card, framing the strike campaign as a sign of Ukrainian weakness rather than strength, an attempt to nibble at what it cannot win outright. That framing is itself worth noting precisely because it's contested, unverifiable propaganda-adjacent commentary rather than a sourced, factual claim. And we're including it here specifically so you understand both sides are actively fighting the narrative war around Crimea, not just the physical one. The pressure on Crimea hasn't stayed confined to roads, rail lines, and power grids. It extends out to sea, and that part of the story actually predates the middle strike campaign by years. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was headquartered for decades at Sevastopol, on Crimea's southwestern coast, and for the first stretch of the full-scale war, it operated from there with relative confidence. That confidence broke down over time. A September 2023 Storm Shadow missile strike hit the fleet's headquarters directly in Sevastopol, according to reporting from Euromaidan Press, citing a Ukrainian defense analyst, and it marked a turning point after which key elements of the fleet's command structure began relocating away from Crimea entirely toward the Russian port of Novorossiysk. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, by early 2026, roughly 30% of the Black Sea Fleet's combat strength had been lost or seriously damaged, a tally that includes the flagship cruiser Moskva, sunk in April 2022, the submarine Rostov-on-Don struck at dry dock in Sevastopol, and the large landing ship Minsk, damaged so severely in port that Ukraine's Ministry of Defense assessed its restoration as economically unviable. That naval pressure has followed the fleet even after its retreat to what was supposed to be a safer harbor. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense documented an April 2026 strike on Novorossiysk itself, involving more than 200 drones in a single night, which sank the minesweeper Valentin Paykul and damaged 2 anti-submarine ships, according to the ministry's own after-action summary. A separate strike days later critically damaged the frigate Admiral Makarov, one of the fleet's more advanced Kalibr missile-capable ships, per the same Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reporting. A Ukrainian defense analyst told the outlet Liga, Net, in reporting picked up by Euromaidan Press in April 2026, that the fleet has now lost its ability to project power at sea entirely, and largely just supports land operations from Novorossiysk instead. Ukraine hasn't limited its naval campaign to warships either. Back on August 22, 2024, Ukrainian forces struck the rail ferry Conro Trader at the port of Kavkaz near the Kerch Strait, while it was loaded with fuel tank cars, causing it to catch fire and eventually capsize, according to reporting from United 24 Media, specifically because that ferry had become a workaround for moving fuel to Crimea after the Kerch Bridge itself was damaged. Even Crimea's air defense picture has been chipped away in parallel. Ukraine's SBU security service said it struck the Belbek military airfield in occupied Crimea, damaging a MiG-31 fighter jet, along with maintenance infrastructure, and separately hit a radar station identified as the MR-10M1 MIAS-M1 system, according to reporting from Euromaidan Press in April 2026. Acting SBU Chief Vasyl Malyuk said at the time that strikes like these represent, in his words, not only direct losses of equipment, but a degradation of the enemy's ability to control the battle space and plan further attacks. Taken together with the August 7th radar and relay strikes near Olenivka that opened this story, the pattern is consistent across more than a year. Air defense and reconnaissance systems on the peninsula have been treated as priority targets right alongside the fuel and transport network, because the supply line is only as safe as the radar covering it. There's also real ambiguity around casualty figures tied to some of these strikes, and that ambiguity deserves to be stated plainly rather than smoothed over. Russian officials said that a Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian Black Sea resort town of Gelendzhik, along with a separate strike inside Crimea, killed a combined 11 people in early August 2026, according to reporting from Ireland's RTE. Russian officials specifically said 7 people, including 3 children, died at Gelendzhik in what they described as a deliberate attack on civilians, with around 40 more wounded. Reuters, according to that same RTE report, verified social media video appearing to show a drone strike hitting a crowded beach area near Gelendzhik, and confirmed the location by matching visible buildings, coastline, and trees against satellite and archival imagery. That verification process matters. It means the location and the impact of that strike are independently confirmed by a wire service, even though the broader question of intent, whether civilians were deliberately targeted or whether this was a military target that went catastrophically wrong, remains disputed between Ukrainian and Russian accounts and hasn't been independently resolved by either side's neutral investigators. So where does all of this actually leave Crimea and the Russian forces depending on it as of this week? Not stranded, in the literal sense the headline implies. Ships are still crossing the Kerch Strait. Convoys are still, however expensively and however dangerously, making the run down the Novorossiya highway. Russian command has not lost control of the peninsula, and no credible source, Ukrainian, Western, or independent, is claiming otherwise. But the picture that emerges from these confirmed strikes, stacked one on top of another across April, May, June, July, and now into August 2026, is of a supply system running consistently behind its own demand. Bridges damaged faster than they can be fully repaired. Energy infrastructure, 187 targets by Commander Brovdy's own count in just over a month, struck faster than it can be restored. Fuel truck incentives tripling because drivers increasingly don't believe the trip is safe. Radar stations and drone relay hubs, the systems meant to detect and coordinate against exactly this kind of campaign, getting hit themselves, as confirmed by Ukraine's general staff as recently as August 7th. None of that is manufactured. Every figure in every strike described here traces back to a named source: Ukraine's general staff, Ukrinform, Kyiv Independent, Kyiv Post, the Moscow Times, Al Jazeera, RTE, Reuters, and Commander Robert Brovdy's own public statements, alongside acknowledgement of Russian-aligned commentary, specifically where it disputes Kyiv's framing. What isn't independently confirmed, and what we flagged as such throughout, includes some of the specific casualty circumstances at Gelendzhik, some monitoring channel-only reports of fires and explosions that haven't received an official government statement on either side, and any claim of Russian forces being literally cut off rather than operating under sustained worsening strain. That distinction between a peninsula under genuine and escalating pressure versus a peninsula in total collapse is the honest version of this story, and honestly, it's a more useful one to understand than a cleaner but exaggerated headline would be. All of this is unfolding against a diplomatic backdrop that makes the military picture even more complicated. And it's worth walking through because it directly shapes what happens to Crimea next. At the NATO summit in Ankara in July 2026, President Trump praised Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, calling him ingenious for the country's deep strikes into Russian territory, and announced the U.S. would license Ukraine to produce Patriot air defense missiles domestically, according to reporting from NPR. Zelensky told reporters at that same summit that Ukrainian forces were eliminating an average of 30,000 Russian troops a month, a figure attributed directly to him rather than independently verified by NPR or any neutral body. Yet, in the same stretch of 2026, Trump has also repeatedly said publicly that Crimea will not be returned to Ukraine as part of any peace settlement. In an interview published by Time magazine and covered by the Associated Press, Trump said plainly that Crimea will stay with Russia, arguing that the peninsula's Russian-speaking population and its history as a Russian naval base predate the current war, and that Crimea's 2014 annexation happened, in his words, on Obama's watch, rather than his own. Separately, in comments reported by Time, Trump told Zelensky directly to give up on the idea of Ukraine ever reclaiming Crimea or joining NATO, saying there was, in his words, no getting back Crimea and no going into NATO for Ukraine. That creates a genuinely strange dynamic on the ground, and it's worth naming directly rather than glossing over. The same peninsula that Ukraine's military is actively and effectively degrading through the middle strike campaign, night after night, is a peninsula that the sitting U.S. president has already said publicly he expects Russia to keep in any final settlement. Whether continued military pressure on Crimea is aimed at eventually forcing it back under Ukrainian control, or is instead aimed purely at degrading Russia's fighting capacity elsewhere along the front, while the political map stays roughly where it is a question that even close observers of this war don't agree on, and it's not one this script is going to pretend to resolve for you. So here's the actual open question, and it's one worth sitting with, rather than rushing past. If a strained, expensive, increasingly disrupted supply line is enough to force Russia to triple hazard pay for civilian truckers and reroute traffic around bridges faster than they can rebuild them, what happens if this pace of strikes continues through the rest of the summer and into the fall, when Crimea's energy demands typically rise again? Does sustained pressure like this eventually force a strategic choice inside the Kremlin? Or is this simply the new, uncomfortable normal that occupied Crimea has to operate under indefinitely? Let us know what you think happens next. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it develops.